Today we are going to have the third in a series of hearings dealing with the legislative proposals to alter the economic framework of the United States government's relationships with the Republic of South Africa. And during the past two hearings, we've heard from the administration, from Senators Kennedy and Weicker, who drafted S-635, from academic and legal experts on the subject, and from those who directly represent or audit U.S. companies that currently do business in South Africa. I think these hearings to date have built a strong record for dealing with the issue. My colleagues and I have learned a great deal about the realities of U.S. banking and investment and U.S. commerce with South Africa, and about the details of current proposals to alter the relationship we have with South Africa. Today, if I may say so, we're particularly lucky to have with us a man who's done more, in my judgment, than any other single individual in the United States to effect peaceful change in South Africa and to better the lives of the non-white population in that country. South Africa, as we all know, has become one of the dominant issues on the political agenda for 1985, and it is clear that Congress will be taking action on that issue this year. The Reverend Leon Sullivan, who I am so pleased to have as a constituent of the Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, is an individual who is famous not only in Philadelphia in our state but throughout the country, and in particular we in this country, I think, owe him a deep debt for bringing the issue of South Africa to our attention and to our moral consciousness many, many years ago. Since the founding of the Republic of South Africa in 1948, Americans have been concerned about U.S. corporate investment and involvement in that troubled land. Most have despaired that anything could ever be done peacefully to better the lot of the non-white population in South Africa. Reverend Sullivan has shared that concern, but apparently not that despair, and he has gone beyond rhetoric to promulgate a voluntary code of conduct for U.S. companies operating in South Africa. Today, the majority of black workers employed by U.S. companies are covered by Sullivan principles. As a result, they are guaranteed desegregated facilities, equal pay for equal work with their white counterparts, and other principles of fair play and decency which we take for granted here in this country. From 1977 until today, no one familiar with South Africa has difficulty understanding what is meant by the term Sullivan principles. Reverend Sullivan's importance is reflected in the fact that his name has become a term of art and a symbol of fair play, and I can't think of any more fitting introduction to cite that fact, and I can think of no one who is more knowledgeable in the subject of U.S. corporate involvement in South Africa than the Reverend Leon Sullivan, from whom we'll be hearing in a moment. I would also like to note the presence in our audience of Mr. Norman Holmes. Mr. Holmes would you please stand up? Mr. Holmes has come to Washington from Philadelphia to present a petition with more than 500 signatures on behalf of Philadelphia lawyers against apartheid. Mr. Holmes, I'd be happy to receive your petition at this point, and we'll make it a part of the record without objection. Thank you very much. I would also like to note the presence of Philip Lacovara, representing the American Bar Association. Because of the shortness of time caused by the rescheduling of Treasury Secretary Baker to today's date, this hearing will necessarily have to be truncated. Therefore, we're unable to receive the oral testimony of Mr. Lacovara, and instead will make his written testimony a part of the hearing record. So without objection, Mr. Lacovara, however, you are here. You're available, I know, to answer any questions, should any of my colleagues wish to direct any questions to you. Well, now I'd like to turn to the Reverend Sullivan, unless any of my other colleagues have remarks they'd like to make. Senator Proxmire?
Yes, I'd like to just say that, number one, I would appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, if you would permit a letter from the President of Wellesley College supporting the Kennedy-Weicker bill to be included in the record. This is Nannerl Cohen. And
without objection, Senator Proxmire, if you have to do so.
And I also would like to say how delighted I am and impressed I am that Mr. Philip Lacovara, representing the American Bar Association, has submitted a statement which supports sanctions with respect to South Africa, although it doesn't support any particular bill. But it does support sanctions, and I think that's extremely important. I'll tell you, the ABA is very, very helpful to us. When they changed their mind on the Genocide Convention, it made all the difference in the world. So it's good to have this remarkable organization supporting it. I have a statement, an opening statement, that I will not make because the time limitation, but I want to add my words to a welcome that the chairman has given to Reverend Leon Sullivan. I've heard him a number of times over the years. He's been an inspiration to all of us, and I think the chairman is exactly right in saying that Mr. Sullivan, more than any other individual by far, has kept this issue alive and has prodded our conscience and put us in the position where we are in now. And I think that means that we're going to act, and act effectively, and do something about changing that apartheid system in South Africa.
Are there any other statements by any members of the committee?
In the interest of brevity, I'll put mine on the record.
Without objection, Senator Dixon's so ordered.
No statement. I will have some questions for the record, Mr.
Very
Chairman.
well. Reverend Sullivan, at your pleasure. Welcome again.
Thank you, Senator Hines, and always a privilege and a pleasure to see you. And I'm happy to be here with your colleagues. I have a brief statement, and then I'll be happy to respond to questions. I welcome the opportunity to bring this testimony before this important Senate committee. The question of apartheid is a tragedy in the world, and we must take the lead in America to bring about its abolition. My main interest here has to do with the effects of multinational companies on the ending of apartheid. Multinational companies in South Africa, along with other influential institutions and thrusts, can be a major force in the liberation of blacks in that nation. However, for this to happen, American and other outside companies doing business in South Africa must be pushed to the utmost to eliminate all racial discrimination in their own operations and to use their great strength to help persuade the South African government to end all apartheid laws. American companies that fail to do so should be compelled to leave South Africa because they have no moral justification for remaining there. Action by the companies, however, is not the total solution to the problem of South Africa. Apartheid is the most racist and ruthless system on earth, and its destruction will require the combined efforts of companies, unions, churches, governments, world public opinion, and most of all, the courageous efforts of those within South Africa itself who are standing up for justice and freedom. But companies can and should play a major role in this effort because the companies have been the main beneficiaries of the injustices from this unjust system in the past, and they have a duty to help end those injustices. American companies in particular should set the example. We are the representatives of freedom and justice, I am told, in the world. This can be done through, among other ways, full adherence to the Sullivan Principles. The principles are an equal rights code for corporate conduct in South Africa. They were initiated 8 years ago and are the most stringent and demanding measurement for corporate equal rights responsibility in the world today. Essentially, the principles call for an end to all discrimination against blacks in company operations, equal pay for equal work, training and elevation of blacks in large numbers to supervisory and administrative jobs, including black supervision over whites, extensive aid to housing, health, and other community programs, the recognition of representative, independent, free black trade unions, thereby helping empower the black worker, who is the greatest hope for peaceful change in South Africa. And the companies are called upon for major emphasis of support to education for blacks, without which political apartheid will one day become economic apartheid. A strengthening of the principles now requires United States companies to actively support the freedom of blacks to work or live where they choose, as well as to work actively through their lobbying process and any other means at their disposal for the end to all apartheid laws. This means United States companies must actively work for the end to influx control, forced removals, passbook requirements, detention without trial, and for black full citizenship rights and the full and equal participation of blacks in the political process. The principles are working. As a result of them, United States plants are desegregated, equal pay for equal work is beginning to be paid to black workers, blacks are being elevated to administrative and supervisory jobs, blacks are supervising whites, blacks are being trained for new technical skills. Independent free black trade unions are beginning to be recognized. Schools are being built. Housing developments are being constructed. Health centers and programs are being initiated. And young blacks by the tens of thousands are being assisted with better education. Also, the impact of these principles goes far beyond these gains and the opportunities provided to the limited number of blacks employed by American companies, who are less than 1% of the total black workforce. The principles are a catalyst for change and affect conditions for black workers throughout the country. They are a lever on other companies. A group of South African companies employing 1 million workers, mostly black, are now using the principles in their practices. The principles have started a revolution in industrial race relations across South Africa. Also, they have become a platform for many in South Africa arguing for equal rights in government and other places. But with these gains, far, far, far more must be done by American and other companies of the world. Growing and mounting tides of protest and turmoil within South Africa make fundamental change crucially urgent if that country is to avoid a bloodbath. The pace of change is far too slow. The companies in South Africa are powerful and must become more active in the struggle. 1,000 companies from America and the world in South Africa practicing equal rights and taking firm stands against apartheid laws would make a dramatic difference in helping bring about the ultimate dismantling of apartheid. The companies must be pushed harder for faster results. The United States company effort is the most vital and impactful company effort in South Africa today. But even with that, unfortunately, more than 100 United States companies in South Africa still do not support the equal rights principles, and some who claim to be supporters are dragging their feet and getting failing grades. All United States companies should become a part of these principles and measure up fully in their implementation, or those who fail to do so should be pressed to leave South Africa through total divestment actions, stockholders' resolutions, boycotts, and the actions of the Congress of the United States. Also, Congress should make the newly tough and amplified principles mandatory for all United States companies in South Africa. backed up with embargoes and sanctions and other penalties for noncompliance. For I would rather see 50 American companies remaining in South Africa, aggressively promoting equal rights and actively opposing apartheid, than 300 American companies, and of them, many using the principles as camouflage and doing business as usual. The non-complying United States companies must shape up or get out of South Africa. 2, companies from other nations doing business in America, as well as doing business in South Africa, should be required to follow stringent equal rights principles in South Africa or face severe United States import restraints to the ability of the United States to do so. These companies must also be pressured within their own countries, by their own peoples and their own parliament to oppose apartheid aggressively. Unfortunately, European companies are lagging well behind the Americans and the Japanese, who do such heavy business in the United States, as well as sell massive amounts of commodities in South Africa, are doing nothing. South Africa is the place for the companies of the world to demonstrate a concern for justice and benefits to humanity. The enemy of capitalism is not communism, but the selfishness of capitalism. It is time the companies showed another side to the world. Meantime, until we see clear and effective movement towards the abolition of this ruthless system, meantime, there must be a moratorium on all American economic expansion in South Africa until apartheid is ended officially. There should be no new investments, no new bank loans to the South African government or its agencies, an end to the sale of the Krugerrand, and a halt to the sale of any equipment, material, or services to the military or police of South Africa, backed up with embargoes, sanctions, and other penalties by the United States Congress. It is also my hope that the President of the United States will support strong measures involving sanctions and will set aside constructive engagement and use direct diplomacy with the South African government, calling in the strongest of terms for the abolition of apartheid. Finally, more and more it is clear to me that a deadline is needed for conclusive action in South Africa. Lives are being lost daily, and that nation is near the threshold of revolution. It is my view, therefore, that if apartheid has not in fact ended legally and actually as a system, statutorily, within the next 24 months, there should be a total United States economic embargo against South Africa and the withdrawal of all American companies. And that it will be followed, hopefully, by similar actions by other nations and companies in South Africa from those nations. There are those who say that these measures cannot work. But I say, with the help of God and with the action of this nation, ringing a new bell of freedom for black rights in South Africa, showing the world that we are drawing the line, and taking a stand against apartheid. I say, with the support of those in this nation and within South Africa who want to see a nonviolent resolution to this issue, and I say, with the help of God, the peaceful ending of apartheid can still be attained if governments, the companies, and others searching for workable solutions act now before chaos comes and the sky falls. Thank you very much, Mr. Senator.
Reverend Sullivan, the term anticlimax for what the rest of us are going to engage in is inadequate to describe what is about to happen. I have a few questions, as I suspect many of my colleagues do. I cannot begin to make my questions nearly as eloquent as your very moving declamations. I gather from your testimony, though, that you do feel that the Sullivan Principles have caused some companies, not all, to improve their practices where the companies might otherwise not have done so. Is that right?
That's an absolute fact. The principles have been the main factor that have caused the companies to improve their efforts and to work towards changes.
Now, the Sullivan Principles are voluntary. What is it about the current Sullivan Principles system that causes companies that do adhere to it to do so?
Because of the commitment, I think, more from the leadership of the companies, that they want these principles to be aggressively followed, and by the support and the aggressive efforts of management who are required to carry out those commitments, and because of the initiatives that are taking place within South Africa in order to implement these principles.
Now, a number of U.S. companies, indeed I'm told more companies than not, do not participate in the Sullivan Principles. The ones that do participate cover the majority of workers. The ones that don't are more numerous as entities, but have the minority of workers. Do you believe that the companies that do not participate in the Sullivan Principles should be required to do so by law?
I absolutely believe all United States companies doing business in South Africa, if they remain, must be required and should be required to do so by law.
What will the results of such a law be? Would you anticipate that all of the companies now there, in fact, would comply, or would some of them simply close up and leave? You've been there many times. You've looked into this on many occasions. What, in your best judgment, would be the likely outcome of that requirement?
Some of these companies will close up and leave. Some will aggressively follow through on the implementation of these principles. And I believe through their efforts will make up those who leave.
Is it because their competitors would not be implementing anything similar to the Sullivan Principles that the companies that would close up and leave would do so, or would it be just because they don't like being told what to do?
Many companies will not want to be told by the government what to do, and who would prefer, rather than to risk this kind of relationship with government, would take the side of leaving. Some would leave because to live up fully to the Sullivan Principles takes away a lot of profit. It means that salaries must be escalated to be equal to white workers. It means that support must be given to the development of schools, health education programs. It means that they must assume a cost far, far, far beyond anything companies have ever had to assume before. And therefore, taking it all in the picture, there are many who will say that it's cheaper to leave And certainly the problems would be less if they left.
And those companies that now do subscribe and implement the Sullivan principles do pay a cost.
All companies, if they're subscribing and supporting the principles, pay a cost in new wages first to black workers. One reason I initiated the principles is because of cheap labor. Many companies for 100 years, 200 years from Britain and other places have been going to South Africa. And they've been making vast profits off of cheap labor. So I wanted to do away with that cheap labor and bring equity to the black worker. And that is why I stand so strongly behind independent free black trade unions, because they can do more in that respect than I can do. Because internally they can collectively bargain for equal wages and see that they come. But the effort of the principles takes away a lot of that extra profit and brings them into line with the kind of business relationships and profits that should be.
How do you feel that the Sullivan principles, your principles, compare to other national codes of conduct for their companies in South Africa, if there are any? Are the Sullivan principles unique? If they're not unique, are they stronger, better, or are there some codes of conduct that in fact are better than ours?
The Sullivan principles are the forerunner of all codes of conduct in South Africa. And because of our measurement criteria and because of the process of the evolving nature of the principles that requires for companies to continue to strengthen the implementation, the principles are stronger, more stringent than any equal rights codes in South Africa by far.
What you've described as costly, you've described it as voluntary, you've described it as effective. What resistance has there been by American companies to subscribing to your principles?
I've received letters, telephone calls, and visitations from companies who have told me it is not their desire and it will not be, they will and they will never become signatories to our principles, where the operations of their companies are determined by a black preacher, by a preacher, or by anyone else who might be telling them what to do. I've heard that from companies that it's not their role to get involved in matters like this in foreign countries. It is their role to do business as business, and it's not their role to get involved in social change and other matters.
Is it your impression, I'm really going to ask you a two-part question, first, that the South African government encourages any of these companies that have not signed up to the Sullivan Code to indeed not to do so, and secondly, going a little bit beyond that, what has been the reaction of the South African government to the Sullivan principles? Have they resisted it? Have they fought it? Have they objected to it? What has been their reaction?
I have no record that the South African government has attempted to dissuade American companies from becoming voluntarily connected with the principles. I have no record of that at all. I do know that when I began the initiation of the principles, there was a sympathetic receiving of these principles from government officials when they began, because perhaps they thought that there would be a few statements and perhaps they would not go very far. But they did not realize that these principles represented a beginning, and that the intent of these principles is not just fair employment practices, but the elimination of apartheid. And now these principles, with this new, stronger amplification, requires for companies to lobby for the ending of all apartheid laws and to get to the heart of the influx control, to see that black workers have the right to live and work where they choose. And so at this point, I would think that the South African government would be perhaps very much disturbed about my direction, and I believe particularly these sanctions and these deadlines.
Less than 1% of all the black workers in South Africa are fortunate enough to work for a company that subscribes to the Sullivan principles. very small fraction at that. How about the other 99% of the workers? To the extent that they, what do they know about their fortunate few brethren who may be working in companies covered by the Sullivan principles? And do they believe that your principles, in fact, are making a difference and can make more of a difference?
I'm certain you will find all kinds of shades of opinion in South Africa from blacks and whites pertaining to the principles and their effectiveness. I'm sure that blacks who are not working at all will say that it's not helping at all because nothing is helping a man who has no job. And certainly they're not helping persons and companies where they're not being implemented and where they're not being used, certainly outside of American companies. So I would think that the worker in the plants outside of American companies would be hopeful that equal rights, strong equal rights efforts would be implemented within their own work environments. And one reason the principles are important, in spite of the small number of blacks in proportion to the total workforce working in American companies, is because they are a lever on the other companies within South Africa, and for the catalyst that they are on other companies in South Africa. It was 5 years ago that the chairman of one of the largest corporations in South Africa visited me and asked what they could do. I asked him to go back and organize a consortium of 10 companies, or as many as he could, that employed 1 million workers outside of American companies, and to begin the implementation of the principles in their spirit, if not in their signatures. They went back, this was done, and for the first time in those companies employing 1 million workers, desegregation began. Efforts began towards equal pay for equal work. Registered and unregistered unions for the first time began to be recognized, and they began to even speak out against apartheid laws as oppressive. So the catalytic effect of the principles goes far beyond the American companies. They are a lever. They're like a crowbar. If I decided that the changing of the practice of the American companies was all that was needed, I would never have started these principles, because it would have been an illusion. The American company size is too small in number to change or help change in any proportion South Africa. But you can take a little pick, and if you have a hammer on it, you can move a mountain if you hit it at the right place. And what I'm trying to do with these American companies with a pick and a hammer is to hit them at the right place.
Reverend Sullivan, my time has expired, but thank you for such direct and eloquent answers to my questions. Senator Proxmire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm delighted to hear that little pick and hammer story, because I think that that's a good analogy. We had the one trouble with your principles, and I think they're excellent, and they've obviously had a great success. And I don't know anybody else, anybody in the country who's had the principles named after them as you have, named after you, that have had this kind of remarkable effect. But a difficulty now is we had 4 witnesses here on May 24th who appeared, generally 3 of the 4 were against the Kennedy-Weicker bill. The people who appeared, as I recall, were for the Sullivan principles. The Sullivan principles are fine. Let's keep them the way they are. They're doing the job. That's all we have to do. Now, you're Mr. Sullivan.
I'm Leon Sullivan.
You're Leon Sullivan.
I'm it.
You're the Sullivan principles itself. I'd like to hear how you feel about whether Sullivan principles are enough, whether we should do more.
Absolutely not. For they are a part of a broader effort, but they are not the solution to the ending of apartheid. It is important that there be sanctions and embargoes and the kinds of actions that are embodied in the Sullivan-Gray Act and in the Kennedy-Gray Act. Well, you can call it Sullivan-Gray too. He's one of my, I vote for him, he's my little
Senator Kennedy would be delighted to have him called a Sullivan.
I don't know how Senator Weicker would feel to get removed from...
I support totally the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1985. Because I believe, as I've stated, that no new investments no new bank loans, the end of the sale of the Krugerrand. I think you have to send a strong message, and I think the ending of any materials or equipment to the South African police or military, all these are essential as we begin to bring this iceberg down. But I do think that the mandating of the principles is important, because all American companies should be a part of this and be measured alike if they remain there. And for one other reason, Senator Proxmire, I've made trip after trip to Europe. I've been to London, I've been to France, I've been to Germany, I've been to Denmark, I've been to Sweden. And something has to happen in the world that will move the parliaments of the world to require that companies from their nations aggressively follow equal rights principles in South Africa. There is more patience with South Africa in Europe than there is in America. There is not the desire for change in Europe as there is in America. And America must take the lead. And what the United States Congress does will have an effect on every parliament of the world. And I'm hoping, too, that will have an effect on the Japanese parliament, because the Japanese take up where others leave. And if they take up where others leave, I say either they must practice equal rights in South Africa when they take up, or we should not have their commodities in America. I think we should get tough with the Japanese, too. Amen.
One of the arguments being used by the opponents of the Kennedy-Weicker bill is that somehow it will result in the loss of jobs by those blacks employed by American firms, and it's harmful to the black community in South Africa unless the blacks in South Africa oppose its provisions, they argue. Since Kennedy-Weicker is not a disinvestment bill, I fail to see the logic in their argument. Nonetheless, it's being made. Now, as one very familiar, as you are, with the situation in South Africa, we'd benefit from your views on this. Number one, would Kennedy-Weicker, if enacted, cause blacks employed by American firms to lose their jobs? And would it I should say, would it help or aid the situation of blacks in South Africa?
I think the Kennedy-Weicker gray bill, whatever it is, talks about no new investments. I think it talks about businesses, whatever they do, doing it out of their own resources. Businesses who will stay will continue to employ black workers. And the fact is, those who leave will be bought up by someone else. So you will still have jobs. I think that the weight on the side of the American is to be there, is that there is no other unified effort in the world that is pushing for equal rights like the Americans. And therefore, they should stay there as long as possible in order to push for the ending of apartheid, if they occur within this deadline. The second concern I have in terms of the black worker and what happens even if he stays on the job, and why it's important that apartheid be ended and influx control be ended, and why the abolition of apartheid is so important, is that the majority of blacks in South Africa are still very poor and unemployed. Those who work in companies are still the minority. Therefore, if you provide opportunities for those in the minority, as I'm striving through equal rights codes, they will move further and further ahead, which I recognize and applaud. But the vast number of blacks still remain stagnant because of the structured discriminatory form of apartheid that requires for people to live in homelands, that requires for people not to be able to move or work where they choose, that relegates them to lower forms of education so they cannot compete adequately in the job market. These forces of deseparation that make this big block of poor, unemployed people remain stable while others advance. And that is why the system has to be ended, so that people will have the freedom to move, because the system that restricts them helps them to move closer to those that have.
I'd like to ask Mr. Lacovara, if he'd come forward and sit at this microphone right here. I want to ask you a question, Mr. Lacovara. I note on page 6 of your statement on behalf of the American Bar Association that you believe that many of the features of S-635, that's the Kennedy-Weicker bill, are consistent with the principles governing economic sanctions advocated by the ABA. Now, people argue against those types of sanctions on the basis that they'll only make the South Africans more resistant to change. Thus, I know with satisfaction your statement on page 3 of your testimony that you believe sanctions can be effective in inducing nations to conform their conduct to international legal norms. Can you tell us whether and why you believe that the economic sanctions in S-635 might be effective in inducing South Africa to change its apartheid system?
Senator, I'll be happy to try to answer your question. The American Bar Association's position supporting sanctions against the South African government rests on two premises. One is the empirical premise that sanctions generally work in legal affairs, and we think that sanctions directed by the United States government at a major trading partner, South Africa, are likely to work. That, however, is only half the basis for the American Bar Association's support for mandatory economic sanctions against the South African government. The other part we would consider a moral or leadership position that we believe the American government should take, and that is whether or not South Africa will respond favorably, as we hope it will, to these sanctions. We think it is important for our own nation to draw the line and not to engage in providing economic support for a regime that enshrines this hateful system in its own legal system. And so, although we have some degree of confidence based on our experience as lawyers that sanctions work to a greater or lesser degree, we don't necessarily expect that these sanctions alone, without the kinds of things that Reverend Sullivan is talking about, will cause the dismantling of the apartheid system overnight. But nevertheless, we think the expectation that sanctions will be effective, coupled with this moral principle, combine to lead us to support the congressional imposition of sanctions against the South African government.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sullivan, we have also in this bill a requirement that the President engage in negotiations to try to persuade other countries to cooperate with us in exercising economic constraints on South Africa to get rid of their apartheid system. And we ask him that the President report to us. Do you think that can be effective? One of the criticisms of our wheat embargo of the Soviet Union when they invaded Afghanistan was that nobody else paid any attention to it, it wouldn't have much effect. Do you think that if the President is vigorous in this respect, that he can persuade other countries to cooperate in a way that can make this really effective?
I believe that if the President of the United States is vigorous enough and committed to that effort, that he could indeed persuade others, particularly Western powers, to become more strident in their efforts against apartheid and to move towards the abolition of apartheid.
In your visits in Europe and elsewhere, did you get the feeling that there was a willingness on the part of a substantial, significant part of the people there, people in power, to act with respect to South Africa, follow our lead if we moved?
I've got a feeling that some persons in leadership roles, particularly in parliaments, would be willing to aggressively act if the American Congress acted. But there is an apathy in Europe regarding South Africa like you would never believe. You do not have the divestment efforts, and you don't have the Free Africa movements, and you don't have the Sullivan principles. You don't have people like me and you and others up here who are talking about freedom for people in Europe as we have it in the United States. But there are those who, once the United States acts, will then unquestionably act. I've met with labor leaders. I've spoken before the International Free Trade Labor Union organizations in Germany and met with the leaders of labor organizations, the Labor Congress in the United Kingdom. And there's a desire on their part to become more formidable in their effort but the apathy is still there. But this action from the United States government will lift it to a point of world consciousness, particularly in Europe, that will prompt the Europeans and the other parliaments and governments to move, whereas before I do not believe they will, barring a Holocaust. Now, the thing that will happen for some countries, for some nations to move, is for chaos to erupt. Some people move when out of necessity. I'm saying that it is possible to avert that chaos. I'm saying that it's possible if we act and move now deliberately with a plan to avert a violent end to the South African condition, that it can be obtained through nonviolence.
Thank you, sir. My time's up, sir.
Senator Sarbanes, then it will be Senator Regal and Senator Hecht following the early bird rule. Senator Sarbanes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reverend Sullivan, I join the others in welcoming you to the committee and for your very strong, eloquent, and effective testimony and for the long-time leadership you've been playing on this issue. I want to repeat a question that Senator Proxmire put to you, perhaps in a somewhat different way, because I think it's very important to get your answer clearly on this record. There are some who use adherence to the Sullivan principles to preclude moving to sanctions, such as are contained in the Kennedy-Weicker bill. So they structure it as an either-or approach. I take it that you, as the author, an advocate of the Sullivan principles, reject that approach and, in fact, see the Sullivan principles as part of a larger effort which embraces within it a support for sanctions. Would that be correct?
Yes, I see the effort of the Anti-Apartheid Act and the Sullivan principles as complementary towards reaching our ultimate objective. And that is the reason I strongly go on record in support of these sanctions and embargoes and penalties. And it is nothing new that I've said, Senator. I've made this statement for the last 5 years.
And secondly, I take it that it's your position that if there's not rapid movement to dismantle and abolish the apartheid system, that in fact the sanctions considered should go well beyond those that are embraced in the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1985. Is that correct?
I say, Senator, sir, that if conclusive action does not occur in South Africa with its government to, in fact, end legally and actually, as statutorily, the system of apartheid within the next 24 months, we should move towards a total United States economic embargo, even to the withdrawing of our diplomatic relations and the withdrawal of all American companies from South Africa.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Mr. Lacovara to come to the table, and I want to take the balance of my time to draw him out on this statement of the American Bar Association, which I regard as a very significant statement, and we want to put some additional troops in the trenches alongside a Reverend Sullivan here. So I'd like to hear from Mr. Lacovara. First of all, the Bar's perception of the apartheid system and what they find so repugnant in it, and secondly, the position that the ABA has now taken on what we should do to remedy or rectify that situation.
I'll respond to those questions, that two-part question separately, Senator. We have asked that included in the subcommittee's report be included the report that was before the House of Delegates when it adopted its resolution last August. This is a report of some 30 pages in length, copiously footnoted, describing on the basis of not only the observations of an ABA delegation that went to South Africa, but the testimony of others as well as various determinations by international agencies and by our own State Department that the South African system of apartheid is inconsistent with the rule of law that is subscribed to by all of the civilized nations of the world. We describe in the report, in the House of Delegates, the ABA's policy-making body had before it this report, the variety of conditions to which Reverend Sullivan has referred. The Homelands policy, for example, the forced relocation of black citizens, the attempts to denationalize South African blacks, the pass laws that restrict the ability of black South Africans to travel or to work freely, the various internal security laws that are, of course, of special concern to members of the legal profession because they, like the apartheid system itself, involve the perversion of the concept of law, which is supposed to be for the protection of the public and of the individual, whereas under the South African legal system, not only is this system of racial segregation enshrined in its constitution and statutes, but all of the forces of law are devoted to making that system work, including special powers given to the police and the Interior Ministry to suspend rights, to ban, to exert all of the kinds of forms of repression through the authorization of the law that we find so detestable. These are the conditions that led the American Bar Association to determine that it is absolutely fundamental for the American government to take strong action through the imposition of sanctions to do whatever we can as a people to induce the South African government, which is responsible for this system, to begin to dismantle it as promptly as possible. Turning to the second part of your question, Senator, what does the ABA specifically propose? We have lesser expertise in fashioning the specific sanctions. We speak as an association of lawyers. As I mentioned in response to Senator Proxmire's question, we believe generally that sanctions directed at recalcitrant parties can be effective. We have suggested in the statement that we have filed this morning that several principles ought to guide the sanctions that the subcommittee should recommend. The first of these is that the sanctions should be directed at the South African government because it is the government which has implemented and which continues to maintain the system of apartheid and which has the political power to dismantle it if it has the will to do so. We have therefore suggested that regardless of the possibility that other companies or nations may step into the breach if the U.S. begins to ratchet down its economic support for the South African government, nevertheless, we should do what we are capable of doing, which is at least to cease further economic support for the South African government and cease providing some of the instruments that are used by the South African government, the military and the police, for the implementation of this system, particularly in the area of high technology and computer support.
Now, this is a position, an officially adopted position of the ABA, is that correct, by its House of Delegates?
Yes, sir. This is the official position of the ABA.
This is the first time the ABA has taken a position on this issue?
On apartheid, yes, sir. We have other positions on international human rights, but this is the first time the American Bar Association has specifically addressed the question of sanctions against South Africa.
And this ABA position was premised in part on this extensive report which you've submitted along with your statement, which I assume, Mr. Chairman, would be included in the record.
That is correct, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to make the observation that it's been asserted that if the United States acts, that it will in effect become meaningless because other countries will simply move into the breach. Well, first of all, I think there's a great deal to what Mr. Lacovara says, that we ought to do what's right and act in any event for strong reasons. But secondly, both he and Reverend Sullivan have strongly underscored the leadership role which the United States can play and the impact which it can have on other countries. I saw just a few days ago a newspaper report that Norway is moving with respect to the South African situation, and that followed on the heels of the action which was taking place here in the Congress, and in fact the passage of legislation in the House of Representatives. The French Prime Minister just last week stated that France will not be able to continue its investments if in the next 18 to 24 months definite measures are not taken by the government of Pretoria to end the practice of apartheid.
That's great.
And as Reverend Sullivan points out, a strong, forceful role. Well, let me put the question to you. Do you feel that a strong, forceful role by the United States would result in these other countries following the United States lead and taking similar action themselves with respect to the South African situation? Or do you think they would instead seek to fill the breach and simply assume the economic situation that would be made vacant by the American action?
I think the action of the United States government will move other nations and parliaments in the direction of the action of the United States government. And my visits into Europe on occasions gives me that confidence that it would happen. I believe there are those who are waiting for the solid signal of the action of the United States Congress, hopefully followed by the support of the President of the United States. And I think if that occurs, that you will see a significant move across the Western world in particular with respect to a stronger push for the ending of apartheid. And may I say, I want to emphasize the ending of the system, the pulling out of the root. This is not to say you still won't have problems. We still have problems in America after 100 years that we're still working with. But the window of freedom must be open. And that allows people to have the right of citizenship, the right of political equality, and the right to move and work where they choose. The window of freedom is open. And the thing we want to do is to pull the law out of the root, because it is the only such law in the world. And questions have been asked why I'm so involved in this thing. It's not political. I'm not running for anything. First, because apartheid is against the will of God. That's where I am. I'm a preacher. Secondly, because I'm one of 700 million black people in the world, and we can't permit it to continue to exist in this world. And third, because millions of lives will be lost. In case a racial war starts over there, it will become an ideological war. Its effects will spread across Africa. The impact will be on every major city in this country, and riots will occur in your Harlems across this country, and North Philadelphia is like you have never seen in the history of America. Because we will not permit, I will not permit in Philadelphia, this nation to stand beside and fight with a government that is racist and against black people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Regal.
Reverend Sullivan, we've marched together before on OIC and on other issues and civil rights struggles, and we're marching together again today on this one. And I want to thank you for the tremendous moral force you bring to this discussion, which is really what has to sort of drive the conscience and in turn drive the actions of this nation and other nations as well. And when you just made the statement as to why you feel so strongly and why blacks can't permit it are really the same reasons why whites who feel the same way can't permit it either. And so you're not alone in that feeling. In fact, that is a feeling that is our feeling. It's a feeling that belongs to us together. I want to take my time, but I'm going to yield first to my colleague so that he might go ahead of me, because I know he has some. I've heard him discuss this issue before. He has some different points of view on some of the issues that he'd like to raise, and I may want to sort of follow along and sort of go through some of those myself. So if he has no objection, I'm going to let him go next because I know he's anxious to go, and then I'll follow him if I may.
Thank you, Senator Rigo. Reverend Sullivan, when our chairman asked you a question, you mentioned that you thought that the Sullivan principles should be a part of law. Whose law? The U.S. law or the South African law?
For the U.S. law.
These companies that operate in South Africa that you asked to adhere to the Sullivan principles, do they adhere to the Sullivan principles in total in America?
If the Sullivan principles were applied to companies in the American setting, would they?
In other words, you're asking the companies in South Africa to adhere to standards that we do not require them to adhere to in America.
We have equal rights acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, but beyond that we have an Emancipation Proclamation that frees Americans. We have a Constitution that embodies the rights of all Americans to have the privilege to decide those who would govern over them. We do not have written into the statutes of America the deseparation of the races constitutionally. There's no other place that it exists on earth. Therefore, to attempt to relate America to South Africa does not meet the semblance, I think, of an actuality of a humanitarian or a legal or a constitutional or a national condition.
But is it not hypocritical for us in Congress to mandate certain principles that a company operates outside of America and yet not mandate that in America?
We can mandate the efforts of companies from America, other places, because those companies are licensed legally to operate by America. And by those licenses and by that privilege, companies operate by privileges. The privileges of being a part of the United States. And that license lets them operate here and elsewhere in the world on the basis of that privilege.
I don't have all the Sullivan principles in front of me, but obviously these same companies do not adhere to these principles in total in America. Do you agree to that?
I agree with that. The fact is, if the Sullivan principles were applied totally by all American companies in terms of the utilization of its resources and the total initiation of its practices, it would make a tremendous impact on the economic and social development of this country.
Well, let's get back to the original question. Do you think it's right for the American Congress to mandate certain conditions outside of America and not mandated in America to the same company?
Yes, at this point, because in America we have a Civil Rights Act. We have the initiation of the Congress that is on record. We have a Constitution of the United States that protects the rights and the privileges of people in movement and to work in the part of this country. That does not exist in South Africa for the majority of its population. And therefore, American companies operating at the privilege of the American nation should initiate these kinds of equal rights principles, or else they should be deterred from that operation as American companies.
Let's take principle number 6. Improving the quality of employees' lives outside the work environment in such areas as housing, transportation, schooling, recreation, and health facilities. That is what you want to mandate an American company in South Africa, and they do not do it in America.
I think the action of the Congress with respect to the efforts of companies in dealing in housing and education outside the workplace would be a worthy consideration. But my interest is in human state of condition and a part of the world where American companies operate, where the rights of individuals are abridged because of the God-given color of their skins.
I'm not an attorney. I'm one of the few members of Congress that's not an attorney, but I question the constitutionality of such a law. How do you feel about that?
I think it's constitutional for the United States law to not only permit, but to encourage the efforts of United States companies to initiate humanitarian ideals and causes and aims when they're in conformity with the ideals of our American Constitution. I do not separate the American Constitution or the American nation to a geography, that is to a continent, that is to this particular place. I think wherever American presence is, it should represent what America is. And America should stand for equal rights and principles of humanity wherever it is, institutionally, as companies, and even as individuals.
How can we have allies around the world when we mandate principles outside of America but do not mandate them in America?
I think your allies for America in the future will come more strongly as we need it and deserve it on the basis that we exercise our ability to help poor, underprivileged people in developing nations of the world. And I believe that if we do not, the time will one day come when free enterprise and the very thing we hold dear will be taken away from us.
Go on. Explain that.
I think that the world itself, and I'm just a preacher. I'm a Baptist preacher.
I'm just a businessman.
I think the world is at the crossroads in terms of free enterprise, in terms of capitalism, in terms of our way of life and how we deal with other people of the world and how they deal with us. And I think there's a skepticism in much of the world about American principles. Not because the principles are not there in our Constitution, but the principles are not there in our actions. And I believe much of this world is waiting for America to demonstrate its Constitution on the basis of its actions. And those actions must be demonstrated in those parts of the world where there is injustice and where there is poverty and where people are waiting for something to happen to turn their condition around. If it does not, because I said we are at a very important part of time of the world, I believe that socialism and I believe that communism will more and more gain strength in this world until America and a few European countries will be isolated as entities on this earth. And the final battle for your existence will be one that we might well lose, because the population of this world still is poor, still is non-white, still is striving for opportunity. And they're waiting for us to demonstrate our commitment to what we say we believe. And they're saying, practice what you preach, not only at home, but where they are. And if you don't, one day, step by step, country by country, continent by continent, they will turn against us, and they could well destroy us.
Getting back to what you said, don't you think that we would breed skepticism amongst the world mandating something outside of America that we don't mandate here? I just want to follow through on that. You have not answered me on that.
I think that if you mandate against continuation of apartheid, you will have more friends to support that initiative than you could ever dreamed existed. I believe you'll have friends within South Africa, white friends within South Africa, Afrikaners within South Africa. When I announced the deadline several weeks ago, there was a great consternation in America with some of my company friends and others that I'd painted myself in a corner, that I'd never be able to walk out, that the people in South Africa would never receive it, particularly the whites. I received a telephone call from a member of the South African Parliament who preferred not to use his name, thanking me for taking the position because it would give them something to stand upon. There are friends out there who are welcoming, looking for something to happen to break the logjam in South Africa. And I believe if we took this position, we'll have friends and support around the world that we never dreamed we would have before.
Tell me one country in Africa that has better conditions for the blacks than South Africa.
All of them.
Ethiopia?
All of them.
Ethiopia?
Because there is all of them, sir, Senator. Because conditions are not dependent upon the money you have in your pocket. It's the freedom you have in your mind. It's the realization that even if you're poor, one day your children can have a farm. That even if you're uneducated, that one day your children can have an education. That even if there's no school in your village, that one day your children will have a school in their village. And that although you are illiterate, one day your child can be president of the nation. It is the freedom. It is not the money. It is not materialism, material things that makes a person free, or that makes a person rich, or that makes a person proud. It is a freedom in their minds, that they're free as individuals made of God to live and work where they choose, whether they make it or not. That's the difference between black Africa, where you talk about despots, and where you talk about the problems of Uganda and Ethiopia. The difference is there a man can still hope that the day will come when his child can be president of that nation. It doesn't
My
happen.
time is up, but I want to point out one thing. In order to be president of a nation, you have to survive. And in Ethiopia, the death rate and the dying and the sickness is horrendous.
May I just say this?
Yes, and then my time is up.
May I just add one thing?
Yes.
The condition in Ethiopia is a condition that is tied to the tug of nations and powers for controls of parts of the world. And whether we want to accept it or not, America is a part of that tug for power. And to the extent that we can move humanitarianly to help those people, to that extent can we show we're on the right side rather than on the wrong side.
Thank you, Reverend.
Senator Heck, Senator Regal, I think you still have some time left.
Yes, I hope so.
Would the
but
senator,
10 minutes. I took all of his time.
would the senator yield very briefly?
Yes, I yield briefly to my colleague.
I want to make this point before Senator Heck leaves as the one lawyer on the panel, and that is that it is not accurate to say that the Sullivan principles are not mandated in this country and that we're trying to impose somewhere else what we don't impose on ourselves. Principle 1, non-segregation of the races in all eating, comfort, locker rooms, and work facilities, clearly required by American law. Principle 2, equal and fair employment practices for all employees, clearly required by American law. Principle 3, equal pay for employees, clearly required by American law. Principle 4, initiation and development of training programs that will prepare blacks, coloreds, and Asians. In effect, non-discriminatory training programs. That's required by American law. Principle 5, increasing the number in management and supervisory positions. Again, a non-discriminatory application to manage. All of that's required. Now, Principle 6, where you say they've got to try to improve the quality outside the workplace in housing, transportation, schooling, recreation, and health facilities, is made necessary in the South African context because the government imposes a highly discriminatory system in all of those areas and has a two-tier approach in education and recreation and health with respect to their white population, with respect to their black population. It's not necessary to mandate that in this country on the part of the corporations acting outside of the workplace, because the law in this country mandates that the government must practice non-discrimination in all of these areas with respect to all American citizens. So I don't think it's fair to say that somehow we're applying a double standard here. These companies are mandated in this country to follow these practices, and to the extent they involve practices outside of the workplace, it's not necessary to mandate them, because the law mandates that the society in its entirety must practice non-discrimination.
And
Mr. Chairman, before my colleague leaves, too,
May I just answer a telephone call, and I'll be right back?
I understand. Okay. What I will repeat when my colleague comes back to the phone is, because I want to help him see what we're trying to say here, I'd like to sort of bring him to our point of view, although that too is a long journey. But I think that one really has to imagine what it would be like if, rather than sitting here in our own individual circumstances, as a successful white person in America, if overnight you were to wake up the next morning and be in the body and in the circumstances of a black person in South Africa, and until a member of Congress can imagine and have enough knowledge of what the reality is there to imagine what it would be to be that person, which, as you said earlier today, that's an accident of fate as to what body we happen to find ourselves in, or what place on this globe we happen to find ourselves. And so it seems to me that, as you say, it's not the amount of money that's in one's pocket, because you could take most of the senators, and if they were suddenly tomorrow finding themselves as black South Africans and still had their money, the things that they would not have are the things that they would realize is what people need to have.
Right.
And it's not the money.
That's right.
I mean, it's nice to have the money, but without the citizenship, without the standing under the law, without the ability to be a person in the full sense of the word, on an equal standing with any other person in your country and in your nation, your money means nothing. It just means nothing.
Right.
So I'm just going to say to my colleague from Nevada, I think as I listened to that exchange today and previously the other day, in trying to make sense out of it, I was just saying in your absence that I think the only way we can really understand what life is like for a black person in South Africa would be as if we were to leave our own circumstances. And all of us in the Senate, I think, have quite favored circumstances. But if we went to bed one evening and we woke up the next morning and we were black and in South Africa, and that was our reality, and that's where we were and who we were and what we were dealing with, and maybe we had our material wealth. Most of us are in pretty good condition in the Senate, and so we had that. We had money in our pocket. But if we did not have the other things that we enjoy here that the black South African does not have the standing of citizenship on an equal footing with others, or the chance to see that change within one's lifetime or even within one's children's lifetime. The question, I think, is what does the money in the pocket mean? And I'm not sure we can address that question very meaningfully unless we try to imagine what it would be like to be in the shoes of that person, which you and I could very easily be, but for the accident of fate. You had no more to do with landing in your family than I did landing in mine, and we could just as well be black and in South Africa. And the question is, do we have any connection with one another? And I think we do. I think there is, around this globe, connections between people, and that we are really a family of people, regardless of the color and regardless of the background and regardless of the circumstance. And so I want two things for the South Africans: money in their pocket and the measure of decency and dignity within their own land, so that they can live as full human beings with rights that you and I take for granted and would never for a minute give away for all the money that we may have in our pockets. So that's what's missing. That's the part of the equation that's missing. And if we don't see that, and if we don't understand it from inside the experience of that person, then I think Reverend Sullivan is right, and that is we are headed for a catastrophe. The catastrophe is occurring now, in the sense that lives are being destroyed and ruined, hopes are being destroyed and shattered, but there is another fate coming. The catastrophe is going to change, and it's going to turn violent, and it is turning violent. And that violence may not be contained to South Africa, because of the fundamental questions that it poses. And so I think what he's saying to us is something we have to hear and we have to try to understand. And so when you, Reverend Sullivan, talk about the need to set a deadline, it would help me, and I think it would help the committee if you gave us two insights. One, what life is like today in South Africa for that black person that yearns to be a free person and a full person. I mean, what is that life like for that person today, whether they're 50 or 60 or 40 or 30 or 10 or 12 in age? What is that life like today? And number two, what is coming? What is coming down the road in 12 months or 18 months or 24 months or whenever, if these issues are not dealt with along the lines that you've described here? I mean, help us understand those realities.
It would take a black South African to answer your question. I'm a black American, and even I, as a black American, cannot identify with the problems and with the depth of despair and hopelessness of a black person in South Africa. Just assume a person who must live in a certain place because he is black. He must work in a certain place because he's black. His child must go to a certain school, if he goes to any school at all, because he's black. He must leave a certain town by a certain time because he's black. He must ride on a certain bus because he's black. He cannot have due process of law because he's black. He can be picked up at any time, any place, by any policeman because he's black. He can be put in jail and left there until he dies without a trial, without a jury, without a judgment, because he's black. He has no ability to vote because he's black. He looks at his child and he realizes that child cannot go but so far except in that black situation, in that nation of such prosperity where so many nations of the world are taking riches from it and the materials, because that child is black. And that is why, if apartheid is not abolished, with the rising expectations in South Africa, with 20, 30 million, 20, 30,000 people coming out in funeral marches, and with the first time 20, 30,000 people, 50,000 people, 100,000 people becoming a part of stay away programs, and with the first time black leaders, in spite of perhaps the loss of their lives, walking in protest to the jailhouse door to say that we need the dismantling of apartheid. That if apartheid is not pulled out by the roots within the next 24 months, one of these townships is going to break loose. And 20 or 30 or 40,000 people are going to surge towards those urban areas, in spite of who dies. And the military is going to try to stop it. And hundreds of people are going to be killed. And the surge is going to catch on like a chain reaction across that country. And it cannot be contained by the police. And the military its force will come down. And the whole thing will go up in fire. You're talking about a situation where the very existence of a country is at stake. That will involve not only a country, but will involve nations. South Africa, as you know, is situated so that much of the oil supply that goes to the rest of the Western world and some to America must come down around the Indian Ocean. In case of great tragedy and chaos, there'll be those ships still having to flow because we need that energy, we need that oil. And so they will be accommodated by the fleets of their nations. They're not going 1,000 miles off course into the ocean. No ships have the capability of doing so. They have to come around the Cape of Good Hope. It's a strategic necessity that oil keeps moving. The minerals you can do without. You can do without the palladium. You can do without the gold. You can do without the silver. But you can't do without that oil. And at some point, there will be a contact between nations with all that happening there, and you will find a racial war becoming an ideological war. And you will find the beginning of a situation that will involve all of Africa, much of the Western world, and that could become the beginning of an atomic confrontation in that part of the world. And these things can happen within the next 2 years. If we had acted on Nazism, you would not have had the Holocaust. But we waited. Do not wait on South Africa. Act now, because if you don't, America and the world will regret it.
Thank you very much.
Reverend Sullivan, I have just one or two more questions, and then if I had a few questions for Mr. Lacovara, but he has a conference that he has to speak at in 5 minutes, so he has had to leave. Let me just ask you this. You had in your remarks a very interesting proposition as to how we might address the fact that the United States is pretty much alone right now when it comes either to taking any action that the South African government can read as genuine disapprobation of apartheid, or any codes of conduct for companies doing business in South Africa. And you suggested that it might be desirable for the U.S., and you, I think, particularly had some thoughtful words to say about Japan, that it might be a good idea for the U.S. to giving, I assume, some leeway in terms of time, but subject any country doing business both in South Africa and here, any company from another country doing business in both South Africa and here, to some form of economic inconvenience or outright retaliation if those companies from that country did not somehow, some way have a program of implementation presumably somewhat similar to the Sullivan principles. Do I understand your proposition correctly?
Absolutely, you described it. There are codes for Western nations out of the European Parliament. They're called the EEC codes. And there are other codes, but they're not codes that are stringent enough to really prompt the companies to significant action. There is no disclosure of the implementation of the codes by the companies. They are solvents. They are palliatives. They have no strength. And it seems to me, because most of these countries do business in the United States, all of them do business in the United States, and many of these companies do business in South Africa, that we should not only put penalties on our own companies for compliance, but so that our companies, those who even remain in compliance with the principles, even for 2 years, should at least be competitive in the market. But those companies from other nations who otherwise will take the markets and take over when they leave out. And if they do leave out, that at least it's required that those companies who take their place follow the stringent codes that were promoted by the United States government through the Sullivan principles.
You know, in all of the debate we usually have about whether it's Sullivan principles, sanctions, bank loans, investment, no new or none at all, the issue that you have just spoken to often gets ignored. It is often assumed, although we wish it were true, that if the United States does something, everybody else just falls right into place. And that's not to say that we can't set a good example, and that example does not have some impact. But you yourself have named at least one country that you somewhat despair of, I gather, in following anybody's moral example, namely Japan, and they are not alone. Let me, and And to the extent that we place additional requirements or burdens or disadvantages, whatever, on American companies, I think it would be a very good idea for us to seek a method of trying to encourage the other mutual trading partners of the United States and South Africa to do likewise. The last point, I guess, is one that's been a very tough issue for all of us, and it's this. I am, like you, to say the least, a great supporter of the Sullivan Principles. I think they have done a remarkable amount of good. I think we should statutize them. I think we have to give them greater visibility. I think we have to find methods of getting American companies to step up to the line and actually observe them, not just give them lip service either. At the same time, in the Anti-Apartheid Act, S-635, that Senator Kennedy, Senator Weicker, Congressman Gray, and others have introduced, there is, as you know, an immediate no new investment sanction. Yeah. Now, it can be waived under certain circumstances, but as I read the list of waiver requirements, it's probably stretching it to imagine that immediately the no new investment requirement is going to get waived, because while the conditions are good conditions, one would have to be an optimist to think that you're going to get to them overnight. And it has always troubled me that meritorious as taking some actions against, in particular, the South African government may be, to say on the one hand to companies, now, we want you to spend more money to implement the Sullivan Codes, but on the other hand, we're not going to allow you to send more money to your South African subsidiary, that's investment, is somewhat inconsistent. In fact, it's not somewhat inconsistent, it's got to be inconsistent. And I've wrestled with that for some time, and I thought I'd just throw the ball to you and let you wrestle with it for a while.
That's all right. I'm a wrestler. I've wrestled with it too, because I've been concerned about black workers, and I wanted to be sure that black workers continue to have these opportunities that are coming more and more as a result of the principles, largely, and the result of the United States company effort that is unquestionably the forerunner in South Africa in helping bring about industrial race relation change. But I concluded that with situations as they are, it is imperative that the industrial leadership of South Africa and the government of South Africa realize that all United States economic expansion must halt, and that American presence, whatever it is, in the economic field must mark time. Until we can see the extent to which the South African government will move decisively to the end of all of our efforts, the opening of the window of freedom to the black population, the emancipation of the black people through the ending and the abolition of apartheid as a system. And I came down with the conclusion in my own mind that the benefits of the abolition of the apartheid system at this time are more important than the expansion of American companies or any others.
Do we have any reason to believe that the no new investment ban will be, on top of banning bank loans, stopping the importation of Krugerrands, being the main other sanctions, do we have any reason to believe that that is the make weight that will actually cause something to happen that would not otherwise happen if we do the first set of sanctions directed at the South African government? Because it seems to me, in order to say, and I'm not talking about 2 years from now, I'm talking about now, in order to say and we ought to have a no new investment policy for U.S. companies in South Africa in order for that really to be worth the cost, which you yourself recognize. I mean, you yourself, as from what I've said, would say, well, it's not going to be good for those companies. They may or may not be able to make it. Some will, some won't. They tend to be the more capital-intensive companies that need the investment more than others. It is important to be able to conclude with reason that after you've implemented the ban on bank loans and the ban on Krugerrands, the ban on computer sales, and ban on anything that helps the South African government or its police forces repress the majority of people there who happen to be black, that one can make a credible case that that somehow that isn't going to be enough to wake up the South African government, number one, and you have to do something more, and that number two, what is enough, even though it's very limited in one respect, no new bank loans, no new investment to American companies, is somehow really going to make a difference. It's going to tip the scales, and that is, while there may be a lot of moral force behind it, that there is also going to be a sufficient increment of political force here and there to make a difference. You've been to South Africa a lot. You know it better than any other member of this committee. I confess to myself to some skepticism as to whether that's going to be the make weight, but I would value your judgment.
No new investment by the United States will not be the tip weight in itself. But the effects of the United States government taking its initiative will cause a tip weight, because there's no question but that the leadership of the United States will be one that will be used as the standard for others to follow in parliamentary actions and acts. The other factor is that many United States companies are already assuming a policy of no new investments. Many of the companies are saying now that there should be no additional risk economically in South Africa. And that will continue on as this debate gathers, because it's just starting. This 2-year deadline is going to cause it to be heightened even more, because it comes at the beginning of the presidential debates, when South Africa must become a part of that debate. The 2-year deadline ends at that point. It has to become a point of debate. So you're not going to have companies making great expansion and any great investments at any rate. Then you must remember you will still have the divestment movement. You will still have stockholders' resolutions. The efforts of the states and the city pension funds will not go away. The action of the United States companies will not preclude all these other efforts going on in America and in the world. You will still have boycotts. What America is saying is, in a message loud and clear, that this is the direction that must be taken in order to help bring down this oppressive regime. And I think that you'll have more friends and support within South Africa than you would ever believe, because many white South Afrikaners are hoping for something to happen for them to hang their hats on so they can get on with the business of building a free, prosperous South Africa. Because when apartheid ends, South Africa will become one of the most prosperous nations in the world. Businesses will expand beyond their expectations. Half of all the Nobel medals in the world used for technological age are in South Africa. The other half are in Russia and the Baltic states. And if South Africa sees the wisdom of taking that root out, of abolishing they've already begun. The process has already begun. When you admit blacks into political parties, this has already begun. When you recognize free black trade unions with collective bargaining rights, it has already begun. When you abolish laws against mixed marriages, integrating families and bedrooms, it's already begun. When you get government officials talking about ending influx control, talking about citizenship rights for blacks, talking about black political participation, it has already begun. When you get people in South African high places saying, we must talk to Nelson Mandela, because if they don't talk to Nelson Mandela, there will be no resolution to the problem. You've already begun. And those forces will help in 2 years for them collectively to pull that root out. It's not saying that the problem of South Africa will disappear. You're going to have black communities like you have Harlem, black communities like you have North Philadelphia, black cities like you have District of Columbia, and we've been free for 200 years. But the important thing is a man is free to move where he wants to move, to work where he's capable of working, free to say one day, doggone it, I can be president of this country like everybody else.
I can't imagine a better note on which to conclude this hearing. Reverend Sullivan, thank you very much.
Excuse me, sir. Are you with Reverend Sullivan? Is it possible for me to ask you?
Where are you from?
My name's Dr. Pheko. I'm interested in some of the States News Service. It's not actually for a story, but I wanted to ask you a question.
It's late, 1:30 meeting. That's why I asked you something very bad.
If you can be available.
Process I have to play. Process I have to
Write it
play.
down for me so I can show it. Write the question down.
That they cooperate with me in the setting of it. Would you?
Hi, how are you? Whatever you want to send. Yeah, I'll get them for you. And then, but they don't worry about it. There's no rush. No. Thank you very much. You really do this during a power outage. Yeah, right. You don't need an audio system. You don't need an audio system for him to be heard.
At least not after the 360 seconds.
Yeah. What would you like to say to my readers about the future of this legislation right now?
Well, I need